Nothing escalates F1's development war among the top teams quite like the deluge of development synonymous with the start of F1's European season. Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, and Aston Martin all introduced a significant number of new parts. McLaren, which had brought a major package to the previous race in Miami, had some circuit-specific changes here. Red Bull has just about kept itself on top through all that, but there are real signs of it starting to look more vulnerable, with McLaren nearly making it 2 wins in a row. Max Verstappen and Red Bull had to recover from a difficult start to F1's Imola weekend to win, and while the result on paper looks like a return to normality after Lando Norris's win in Miami, the reality is that Red Bull is under pressure. The Red Bull RB20 that raced at Imola featured upgrades to the front wing and nose, as well as the floor. These are subtle changes. Red Bull technical director Pierre Wachet described the modifications as interesting, adding that the upgrade isn't as apparent from the outside. There are tweaks to the chord length of the top 2 front wing flaps to improve the downstream airflow to the leading edge of the floor, and the end plate profile was modified to increase the outwash effect slightly. The floor edge detail has been modified, with the spacing of the vanes slightly increased. The more significant change is further forward, where the upper surface of the floor has been lowered to increase the airflow between the lower surface of the radiator inlet. There are also tweaks to the rear suspension fairings and brake duct vanes to generate extra downforce that's applied directly to the tire contact patch. So, has F1's dominant force moved the goalposts yet again? It didn't look that way as the Imola weekend began or with how it ended. The Red Bull is always at its most vulnerable on a front-limited track like this. But even with that constraint, the car was so far out of its window on Friday, especially in slower corners, where the RB20's refusal to rotate was bleeding lap time away. A few setup changes and more front wing improved the car on medium tires in second practice, but it was borderline uncontrollable at the rear on the softs. A radical rethink for Saturday was needed, and gradually Red Bull managed to refine its aero balance and mechanical setup to better suit the aero upgrade and the demands of the track, which brought the car back into its window over 1 lap. But new problems became apparent in the race, as Verstappen went from being in complete control in the first stint to struggling the longer the second stint on hards went on, and it left him feeling like he was driving on ice. He only just managed to hang on from Norris and admitted after he crossed the line that he'd had to work hard for that one, a sentiment he hasn't shared for quite a while. The fact this weekend turnaround was achieved while keeping the upgrades on the car was important for Red Bull. It shows they worked, and it gives the team the knowledge it needs to define its future development trajectory. That development is needed despite the team's early 2024 domination. Wachet admitted that there is pressure to add performance. Red Bull's already been beaten twice this season on weekends. It hasn't been perfect, and this could well start to happen in normal races too, as it very nearly did here. McLaren ran Red Bull so close, despite bringing little in the way of upgrades to Imola. It had already introduced a comprehensive upgrade package, which Zak Brown characterized as almost a B-spec, in Miami that contributed to Lando Norris's breakthrough win there. The main difference at Imola was that Oscar Piastri had the full upgrade too, having only had a partial update in Miami. McLaren did bring a couple of circuit-specific upgrades, namely a modified rear wing creating more aerodynamic load with tweaks to the underside and end plate area, and a new beam wing for an overall assembly that added up to an efficient downforce increase. That in itself is significant because last year, McLaren struggled to bring track-specific rear wings as it was too focused on much bigger overall car packages. Despite being confident in how well the upgrade worked in Miami, which was confirmed by aero tests in FP1 at Imola, team principal Andrea Stella admitted he was surprised by how close McLaren was to Red Bull on pace. The upgrades actually gave an extra premium in terms of lap time gain, thanks to intangibles such as improved driver confidence that couldn't be predicted in simulation. In the race, Norris only really briefly had to fend off pressure from the lead Ferrari of Charles Leclerc, and in the final quarter of the Grand Prix, he was extremely quick, slashing Verstappen's advantage. Norris reckons he was within a lap or two of winning. McLaren's clearly evolved into more of a Red Bull threat and can challenge it on tracks that suit its car's characteristics, with plenty of medium and high-speed corners. Where big improvements still need to be made is in slow, long-duration corners, an Achilles heel the team believes can't be cured completely for another year or so at least. A Ferrari with a lot of new parts on it was third best behind Red Bull and McLaren and faded despite Leclerc briefly pressuring Norris in this race. So, why did the upgraded Ferrari prove insufficient? Well, the package had been slightly oversold. There was a lot of noise online from Italian media and Ferrari fans that dubbed the car the SF24 Evo and the SF24 2.0, with claims it would gain several tenths of a second. Team principal Fred Vasseur certainly never expected the first major upgrade of the season to be such a game-changer, even though it impacted the whole car from front to back. Minor changes were made to the front wing flaps as well as the rear wing, while the most significant change is to the reshaped main side pod inlet, going to the Red Bull lead overbite style. Ferrari has now joined the vertical inlet to that to make it part of the side pod cooling to improve the airflow through the undercut on the front corner of the side pod. Above this, the S-duct outlet has been removed and replaced with a vane, and the cooling exit at the back of the engine cover has been moved forward and made larger. The side pod features a dramatic ski ramp that gets flowed down into the central part of the diffuser and improves the effectiveness of the Coke bottle area. There's also a floor tweak with an inlet opened up to better connect to the airflow forced inside the tire to help seal the underfloor and reduce drag. So, as we say, extensive but not enough to beat McLaren, let alone Red Bull. Leclerc was a couple of tenths from pole with a deficit just inside its seasonal average to Red Bull, and in the race, it looked stronger than that. Vasseur reckons if Ferrari missed anything, it was on Saturday, not in the Grand Prix. Finishing on the podium 8 seconds behind the winner would have been a good result for Ferrari at most races this year, and Vasseur was pleased enough with that post-race. But it sounds like Ferrari's got some work to do to refine its car setup to maximize its performance through the weekend, as that was being talked about even before the upgrade hit the track properly. Leclerc also suggested Imola is a difficult track to judge because of the importance of curb riding. The likelihood is that with Red Bull still improving its own car and McLaren's massive upgrade proving more valuable, a good but not seismic Ferrari gain simply means it remains right in the mix. Carlos Sainz was admittedly less enthusiastic. He looked a step off Leclerc all weekend and got beaten by Piastri's McLaren in the race, which he said was a struggle plagued by inconsistencies in the car's aero performance as well as some battery issues. Mercedes still isn't a factor at the front in F1, but made more gains after introducing minor modifications to the floor fences and bodywork at Imola, along with circuit-specific improvements to the rear wing beam wing and front brake duct internal ducting. A solid Imola weekend, which ended with an unspectacular but decent run to 6th and 7th in the race, means Mercedes has moved ahead of Aston Martin in our super times averages to become the 4th fastest car of the season. Hip hip hooray. More encouragingly, George Russell said the car felt the best it has all season. He even came within 1,000th of a second of splitting the Ferraris in qualifying. That was helped by the fact the corner speed range at Imola isn't too broad, mitigating the struggles Mercedes has faced in making the car work well in fast and slow corners at the same time. Technical director James Allison believes that weakness will gradually be put to bed over the coming races. Progress is too slow, and Mercedes still has plenty of problems. That includes the time it's losing on the straights and the tendency to become less competitive as the weekend progresses, as Lewis Hamilton pointed out after qualifying. There's still a long way to go for Mercedes, but the Imola upgrade and performance, on top of the front wing and floor edge changes introduced for the previous round in Miami, at least show some modest gains are being made. Mercedes describes it as a small step forward, with slight encouragement about its race pace compared to the teams ahead, but it was nothing more than that. Of the biggest teams to introduce upgrades at Imola, Aston Martin has reason to feel most concerned about its competitive standing. While not the most visually obvious tweaks, Aston declared more new parts to its car than anybody else at Imola, including a revised front wing and nose, floor, diffuser, engine cover, and rear corner, including modified rear suspension. It began the season fighting with Mercedes to be the fourth fastest team, with Fernando Alonso even sometimes scalping struggling cars from that top three group in qualifying. But a difficult Miami weekend has continued into Imola, despite that extensive upgrade. Aston was at the bottom of the top 10 throughout practice, and qualifying was a disaster. Alonso was out in Q1, and Lance Stroll only 13th, slower than Esteban Ocon's Alpine. The tone of Stroll's post-qualifying media briefing suggested that Aston Martin's upgrade hadn't fundamentally shifted the balance of the car into an undrivable window, as happened at Austin and Mexico towards the end of 2023, but simply hadn't added enough extra aerodynamic load to the car compared to the other teams. Stroll said everything was working, but it just wasn't good enough. Alonso wasn't a relevant player in qualifying because, after shunting in final practice, he went off in Q1 as well and eventually had to abort a final lap because he wouldn't have had enough fuel. Alonso then had to start the race from the pit lane after Aston Martin decided to make various setup changes in Parc Fermé. While the circumstances make a good reading of this package difficult, given the absence of Aston Martin's usual reference, the upgraded car doesn't look to be a massive, immediate step forward on what went before. Aston Martin Performance Director Tom McCullough said this was a track the team thought might be difficult anyway, and that was compounded by not being on its game on Saturday. Stroll did drive well in the race to claw his way into the points, but even that just re-established Aston Martin back ahead of the midfield cars it's been beating this season anyway. It looks like it might take a bit more clean running to understand and unlock whatever potential the team does see in these new parts. But Aston will be hoping that understanding comes quickly on tidy weekends to come, and that this isn't foreshadowing a repeat of that nightmare upgrade blip that blighted the latter part of 2023.